On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched an invasion of South Korea. North Korea was supported by the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, while South Korea was supported by the United Nations, led by the United States. The conflict was the first major proxy war of the Cold War. American forces are blue, South Korean forces are green. North Korean forces are orange, Chinese forces are yellow. Russian forces are pink. Realizing that naval and air power would make all the difference in a peninsular theater of operations, the US ordered the production and deployment of carriers, cruisers and destroyers, supplemented by additional army divisions and a forward operating base to provide command and control. Having realized that this was the calm before the storm, the US withdrew its army division from the 38th parallel and sent it to help reinforce the Busan perimeter. The South Korean capital, Seoul, would have to be sacrificed at the onset of the war, but would be retaken later. North Korea began the invasion by sending bomber and fighter wings to harass the South Korean forces. American fighter squadrons based in southern Japan fought valiantly to hold off the North Koreans. They succeeded, but were completely decimated in the process. Three North Korean army divisions thrust into South Korea and quickly captured the undefended capital, Seoul. Three South Korean army divisions rushed to save the city, but were easily pushed aside by more than 10 North Korean divisions. The 11 North Korean divisions pressed on towards Busan. The Americans managed to field 6 divisions and ordered them all to entrench to improve their defensive positions. The defenders managed to hold the line and stop the aggressors. Flushed with success, 2 South Korean divisions defied orders to hold position and raced to liberate their fallen capital. They met stiff resistance from the numerically superior North Korean forces and were ultimately eliminated. The North Koreans launched another assault against the American perimeter at Busan. Another 2 South Korean divisions ignored their orders and raced to meet the North Korean juggernaut head-on. They too were eliminated, but not before they blunted the North Korean thrust. More importantly, they bought the Americans time. As the North Koreans launched their third assault against the American position, they were attacked by the air wings of 3 American carrier groups that had arrived off the southeastern coast of the Korean peninsula. The American naval aviators pummeled the North Korean divisions. The North Korean Air Force tried to provide air cover for their divisions, but were outnumbered and outgunned by the Americans. Flushed again with success, 3 South Korean divisions ignored their orders and raced towards Seoul. The Americans ordered their fighter squadrons back to their carriers. They did not support the South Korean advance because they knew that more North Korean divisions were going to attack again, and possibly the Chinese at some point as well. With more American naval assets arriving every day, the American carriers launched their fighters to destroy North Korean coastal gun emplacements before they could endanger the fleet. Thinking that the worst was behind them, South Korean forces moved north to reclaim their capital. Their wishful thinking was rewarded by 8 North Korean divisions. The Americans ordered a cruiser to harass the advancing North Korean force, but kept the rest of their forces in their defensive positions. The South Koreans continued to ignore their orders and foolishly throw themselves against the North Koreans. only to get beaten down time after time again. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to patiently wait in their defensive posture, content with conducting their naval bombardment of North Korean forces. China and North Korea stepped up their aerial incursions into South Korean airspace, only to be met by an overwhelming number of American naval air squadrons from 6 aircraft carriers. With the skies won yet again, the Americans resumed their aerial attacks against newly built North Korean coastal gun emplacements. Many were destroyed within days of becoming operational. Still firmly in control of the South Korean capital, the North Koreans launched yet another assault against the American defensive positions. Aided by an increasing number of naval assets in the theater of operations, the Americans easily stood their ground and repulsed the invaders. Once the North Korean assault was deflected, the Americans ordered their cruisers on the offensive and had them shell North Korean ground forces. Without an air force to speak of, the North Koreans were helpless as American shell munitions rained down on their heads. For the first time in the war, a South Korean division managed to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea. It was rewarded by being obliterated by the North Koreans. Word came down that the Chinese were unimpressed with North Korea and how it handled invasion of South Korea, and that they were going to directly intercede. The Americans braced for impact as the real war was about to begin. Right on cue, Chinese air assets stepped up their incursions into South Korea, only to be repulsed by the American naval air squadrons. Shortly afterwards, Chinese army divisions came pouring into North Korea and drove straight towards South Korea. They were determined to push the South Koreans and their American allies into the Sea of Japan. The American ordered their cruisers to attack Chinese divisions for the first time in the war. Meanwhile, one lone South Korean division defied orders to meet the Chinese head-on. It too was destroyed, but managed to last longer than it should have, thanks to the American cruisers. Undeterred, the Chinese and North Koreans drove relentlessly towards the American defense perimeter, only to be rebuffed. The Americans sorted 2 carrier air wings to pummel the Chinese army divisions. Much like their North Korean counterparts with no effective air cover, the Chinese were helpless as they were attacked from the skies. With the combined onslaught of American cruisers and naval air forces, the Chinese were slowly beaten back as their divisions were steadily eliminated. Not easily discouraged, the Chinese launched another offensive with new divisions arriving from the motherland. The Americans also deployed more cruisers to the region. Unable to stop the American air and naval attacks, the Chinese saw their forces depleted and ordered the survivors to withdraw to Seoul. Using this time to regroup, North Korea sent 5 fresh divisions into South Korea to reinforce the Chinese and fortify their positions in Seoul. In response, the Americans ordered their cruisers to bombard the North Korean army base that sent those fresh divisions. The American carriers sorted their air wings against the North Korean divisions. After eliminating the army base, the American cruisers turned their attention to the North Korean divisions and eliminated them as well. With the North Korean and Chinese forces driven from South Korea, the American cruiser Task Force turned its attention to a force of 10 North Korean divisions massing near Chongjin. The Chinese used this opportunity to send 2 divisions back into South Korea. The Americans quickly redirected their cruisers to attack the Chinese invaders and easily destroyed them. Turning their attention back to the North Koreans, the American cruisers resumed their pummeling of the North Korean divisions. With Chinese and North Korean forces shell-shocked from the continuous cruiser bombardment, the Americans ordered its army divisions leave their defensive emplacements and head north towards the 38th parallel. American forces pressed forward and liberated Seoul. Chinese forces tried to stop the Americans, but were easily repulsed by cruisers and naval air squadrons operating from the aircraft carriers. Simply not content with evicting the communists, the Americans crossed the 38th parallel and took the fight to the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. The Chinese sent 3 divisions to contest the American advance, but were easily destroyed by overwhelming force. Undeterred, the Chinese sent 5 more divisions towards Pyongyang, only to experience the same result: total annihilation. With Chinese forces held at bay, the American cruisers returned to shelling Chongjin. With American forces firmly in control within North Korea, a flash alert was issued, warning that the Soviet Union might join their Chinese and North Korean allies. Soon enough, Soviet air assets attacked American forces in North Korea. American naval air assets quickly responded to the Soviet incursion. In retaliation, American cruisers commenced their naval bombardment of Soviet divisions based at Vladivostok and massed at the Chinese and North Korean borders. Chinese air assets made a feeble attempt to harass the Americans, but were no match for the American naval air squadrons. With North Korea firmly under its control, the Americans ordered 15 divisions into China to attack Shenyang. The Americans intended to punish the Chinese for its role in the Korean conflict. While the Chinese put up a meager defense of its city, the Russians sent an aircraft carrier and cruiser to end the American cruisers' naval bombardment of Soviet divisions. American naval and air assets easily sunk the Russian vessels. As the American cruisers returned to shelling the Soviet divisions, Russian submarines launched their torpedoes against the Americans. Explosions erupted throughout the American fleet as the submarines pressed their attacks. Meanwhile, the Americans occupied Shenyang. And with that, the Chinese and Russians sued for peace and an immediate end to the hostilities. With all sides in agreement that a unified Korea would be led by South Korean forces, the United States formally accepted the terms of peace. As to be expected, the war was devastating to the Korean population. Pyongyang suffered the worst, with 72% of its population killed. Chongjin lost 34% of its population. Seoul came in third, with 26% of its population killed.